Okay, welcome everybody. We are just waiting a few seconds to let everybody in. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Today we're very happy to have Paul Heidhues from Düsseldorf. He's going to talk to us about procrastination and competition failure. This joint work with Peter Andre, Botond, Köszegi, and Takeshi Murooka. We're also very happy to have as panelists Yair, Antler, and Rhodes. Next week, we'll have Omer Tammuz from Caltech, and he's going to talk to us about local coordination and the geometry of social networks. The rules are the usual ones. I'll remind everyone that we are recording this. Paul is the only author of the paper who's here with us today. So if you have questions, don't put them in the chat. But please unmute yourselves and just ask when there's an apt pause. Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Giovanni. Thank you for having me. So indeed, this is a joint paper with Peter Andre, Botond, Köszegi, and Takeshi Murooka. And so what's this paper about? What do we want to think about in this paper? Many retail markets are what we loosely call switching markets, right? So it's markets in which competition is, working by you choosing a contract, and then if the contract is not good, you're meant to switch to a better supplier. Okay, so we have in mind things like home internet, energy markets, mobile phone, you name it. There's many such markets. And if you talk to regulators or something like that, then sort of the usual complaint is consumer inertia, right? So consumers just don't switch in these markets. Competition is weak because these consumers don't switch. And if you look through the I/O literature, there's lots of estimates of the switching costs that would rationalize these consumer behavior, and you get often very high estimates. I mean, on an extreme version would be like Ben Handel's estimate of $2,000 switching costs in health insurance market for something that seems fairly easy, but there's many such things. And if you go back in the literature to the very beginning, even Paul Klemperer and so on, then they talk about these switching costs as including psychological switching costs, so things that sort of keep you from switching. And sort of one prime candidate for these psychological switching costs is the idea that people procrastinate, right? So you should be switching, but you might as well do it tomorrow. And when tomorrow comes, the problem is it's today and you will still want to do it tomorrow. And so you sort of end up not doing it, or at least delaying it for a very long time, right? And now there's a lot of work in behavioral economics on procrastination and the idea that people repeatedly put off valuable tasks. But they're typically, papers in individual decision problems. And so all we want to do is sort of explore the implications of consumer procrastination for competition in switching markets. And so what we sort of find as a result is sort of a stark competition failure, or what we call an across-the-board failure of price competition. Okay, and so this has sort of two ingredients. So the first one is kind of well understood. So once you signed up with a firm and you're a procrastinator, then you fail to switch to better options simply because you're procrastinating. And that means that the switching, that competition is weak at the switching stage, right? So this, is the same as in prior work. So you find this in Delavigne-Malmendier and so on. I think this is sort of what regulators also have in mind when they talk about procrastinators. And so this is, I think, extremely well understood. But then sort of I/O economists come along and say, well, wait. So if at the switching stage competition is very weak, then consumers are very valuable. If once I attract them, I can sort of charge high prices in the future, then I have a high value of attracting the consumer. And so a lot of the competition should switch to the initial stage. And so you should compete very fiercely for these consumers. And this is so ingrained into I/O thinking that it has like lots and lots of names. Invest and harvest, bargains and ripoffs, waterbed effects, and you name it. I/O economists have lots of names, and this is sort of our typical thinking on the subject. Now we argue, that's not what's going to happen. What happens is consumers think they'll behave optimally in the future, at least in our model, these procrastinators. So it's really not important with what kind of offer I start today, as long as I think I'll soon switch to a very good offer. I'll take whatever is sort of convenient to do right now, thinking that I'll clean the mess up in the future if there is a mess, right? And so that, we'll argue, will lead to weak competition at the initial stage. And this sort of contrasts with the usual thinking in I/O. And indeed, in our setting, there's sort of a competition paradox where the switching competition can hurt consumers, even in equilibria where, as we observe in the market, most of them don't switch. Okay, so the untaken opportunity to switch can be harmful for the consumers. Okay, and so how does this competition paradox come about? Well, the false expectation to switch in the future means that a consumer really doesn't, think or worry about the long run aspects of an offer. So, I'll start with a simple model with linear prices. And in this model, this can lead to effects like temporary product differentiation, leading to permanently high prices. So it was as if product differentiation that is only temporary would be permanent. So think of sort of choosing a video streaming service, right? So you have two alternative video streaming services. You want one of the two. You don't really care. They're pretty much perfect substitutes, except that right now one of them has a show you'd like to see, right? And so in the short run, it is much better than the other. Okay, and so, but then, in a couple of days, you have binge watched the show, and then, from there on, at least an expectation, they're both the same, right? So product differentiation might be reasonably high in the short run, but the short run product differentiation here does not imply that we have long run product differentiation, and yet we will have high prices, such as if this product differentiation was long run. Okay, and so in sort of a variant thereof,
Paul, just a clarifying question. Product differentiation here is exogenous?
Yep.
Thanks.
It will be exogenous. Yeah. And so a version of this is we can take in the right way a limit where the goods become perfect substitutes. So we have a Bertrand limit, and yet firms earn positive profits despite consumers knowing that they want the service, they can compare prices and so on. So it's not kind of the usual explanations that consumers are confused, right? And so if products are only differentiated for a period of time going to zero, and consumers can then switch quickly, then firms will still kind of attract. They can charge some prices because products in the short run are differentiated. And consumers thinking they'll switch just don't care about you offering a lower price unless it's drastically lower. Okay, so I'll show this more formally, but I'll get sort of as a curiosity, I'll get sort of positive profits in a Bertrand equilibrium. And then we go on and move away from linear prices to introductory bonus periods. And we'll argue that these introductory bonus periods can greatly exacerbate the price effect of persistent product differentiation. So now I'll think of product differentiation as just being persistent, right? But in the model, thinking they'll switch after the introductory period, procrastinate when prices get high. Procrastinators do not care about the price thereafter since they'll switch, but they end up paying it because they procrastinate. Okay, and so firms exploit this by introducing a free introductory period followed by the highest price that keeps consumers from switching. Now, this is a very partial explanation because, of course, sort of, we'll assume that firms can't make money-losing offers, and so there's lots of I/O literature on arbitrage and so on that kind of suggests this might be a problem. But they could always just lengthen the bonus period. There's no obvious limit why I don't give a longer bonus period, right? But endogenously in the model, consumers will undervalue the length of the bonus period. And I'll do this much more cleanly later, but roughly speaking, they'll think they'll switch at the end of the bonus period to a cheap contract. So if you give them a month longer bonus period, they don't think it'll save them much money. It delays switching a little bit, but it doesn't save them much money. But you as a firm, you realize they don't switch, and the opportunity cost for you as a firm are very high because you lose the high profits you would earn from these consumers in the meantime. Okay, so that's being very rough. And then something I'm not going to get to in the talk today, but I want to advertise is this sort of ability to cancel contracts can lead consumers to sign up for multiple services, sharply reducing competition. So again, sort of, let's talk this in a video streaming example. Suppose now my video streaming services allow me to cancel after a free introductory period. Now, with time-consistent consumers, competition would be such, and assume, it's efficient to have one service for the consumer, not two. Time-consistent consumers, sort of maybe not surprisingly, competition would work that, if it's efficient to only have one service, you would get one service, and both firms would compete to get you as a customer. And then, if there's not much differentiation, they'll compete harshly, and you don't earn much profits. But once you add the ability to cancel, you might as well sign up for both services and then cancel. That means these services are not in competition with each other anymore. They just write a contract such that you think you'll cancel, but end up not canceling. So since they're now not competing for you in sharp competition anymore, you reduce competition and lead to high profits. But this is just a teaser for those who want to read the paper. I will not show this formally today. Okay.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. How to fit one sort of stylized fact that seems to be realistic? Some firms call customers at the end of the low bonus period and ask them about new contract, trying to remind them that the tariff is about to switch to a higher price. How would you explain that in light of this?
I don't think we couldn't explain this. So to do this, I would need some heterogeneity among customers. So that's not in the basic model, right? But I can get back to the, that would involve them really being scared of consumers switching and not exploiting it. I think the pricing pattern predominantly is the one of exploiting it. So I think in the UK is really cool. They always have fancy words. So they call it the loyalty penalty, which is just this observation that if you not become active, you end up paying far higher prices. I can say a little bit about some of sort of subtle pricing patterns that we don't explain in the basic model, but that you could explain depending on what model of procrastination you choose. But let's defer, push me again at the end. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. But to do this, we also have some survey evidence, sort of a survey with prolific of US consumers. And so we want to sort of document that the mechanism we exploit in the behavioral model on the consumer side is somewhat realistic. And so we provide sort of evidence for one, naive procrastination. So I think there we are on solid ground. Sort of many other people have done this. And the way this works in our framework is sort of many consumers, we'll ask them, sort of what services do you have? Internet at home, mobile, video, audio streaming. And so who's your contract provider, da, da, da. And then we ask them, could you get the same quality somewhere else cheaper? And if they say yes, then we ask them, do you plan to switch in the next 2 months? And we are very explicit that, you might not be certain. If you're not certain, please say unsure. But you might plan to switch. And then we can just look 2 months later, did they switch? And as I'll show you in a little while, many don't. So, we argue these are sort of naive switching plans, right? But then we'll go a little bit further, and sort of the main mechanism driving our theory is this incorrect expectation to switch leads consumers to be unresponsive to offers that would be better for them in the long run, given that they don't switch. And to get at that, we use hypothetical delegation and contract choice questions to argue that, indeed, this is kind of how consumers behave, at least in our survey. So this is just motivating. It's not structural or something at all. It's just motivating that this is a reasonable thought process on the part of consumers. Okay. Let me take a break here if there's any questions.
Sorry, I have a question. What is the difference? Because you keep talking about the procrastination, something like that. But what is the difference between your procrastination costs and simply switching costs?
So I'll get back to that. But the main thing is this procrastination, procrastination needs the consumer making a mistake. So procrastination is if you don't do something that's beneficial for you, and if it's costly enough, right, and you would realize you're procrastinating, then you would just do it now. So it's sort of well understood in the behavior literature that procrastination comes with this incorrect expectation of future behavior. Right? And so what drives this here is this incorrect expectation that you will switch. And that's very different than an as-if switching cost, in which you have correct expectation, but just high costs to switch. Right? So if there were just incorrect switching costs, then the sort of the usual waterbed logic would work in our model. Okay. So I have sort of here a slide with the related literature, and I hope your screen isn't too big so that you can't notice that you might be missing here or there, because of course, lots of people have written on switching markets and so on. So just sort of broadly, what are we related to? Well, we model procrastination. We use an off-the-shelf model as naive present bias, and there's sort of a large literature going back to Donohue-Rabin that does this in theory, and then there's also a bunch of papers that argue that there is empirical evidence for present bias in the field. And then in the industrial organization literature, there's a lot on this consumer inertia, and it's been sort of documented in various industries: energy, health insurance, auto insurance, mortgages, credit cards, and this is really a sort of a selection of many papers that have it. And the stylized fact is that people find this very high switching costs that are sort of hard to rationalize, let's put it that way. Then there's, the old literature on switching costs, or, versions thereof with default effects, or, hidden prices, where consumers don't really appreciate everything about a contract. And so if you attract a consumer, they will become very profitable in the future. And so you compete fiercely for them now. Then, okay, contracting with present biased agents, we've written on this. So this is, in a sense, a contracting model with present bias. But, the literature is focused on very different things and doesn't get this positive profits logic that we have in this paper. And then there's this literature on, high profits on, in the IO sense of price above marginal costs, despite, apparent competition going back to Audible in the credit card industry with 300 firms, and yet, high profits and high interest rates. And, here's a bunch of other papers that discuss this, and sort of our model can rationalize this. Okay. Then let me sort of move on and sort of just briefly, I want to spend some time on the theory, but sort of briefly go through this motivating survey evidence. So let me briefly explain what we did. So we did a two-wave prolific survey of US consumers. Okay, and so on the first wave, we basically asked them, what is your current home internet provider, mobile phone provider, video and audio streaming, right? And then we asked them whether they could switch to the same quality at a lower price. Is it available cheaper somewhere else? If they think that's the case, then we asked them, do you plan to switch or cancel within the next 2 months? And from now on, sort of when I present the evidence, I'm going to just summarize both under switching. In the paper in the appendix, you can see it with just switching or just canceling and so on. But right now, I'll think of canceling as switching to the outside option. And we're very explicit to say, look, if you don't know, just say you're not sure. Okay. And then sort of 2 months later, we just asked them, what contracts do you have? Like 2 months ago, you told us you have, I don't know, Verizon as home internet. Was that correct? And did you switch? Okay. And And then in addition, in the first wave, we'll ask about two hypothetical scenarios. The first basically is, do you want to delegate at 20% of the 2 month saving from switching? Well, the idea is unless you switch with high probability, you should be doing this. And then we have another one where we have them imagining moving into a new house and having to select contracts, and they have to choose between a lower regular price or sort of a contract that has 3 months free and then jumps to a higher price. Okay. So how does this look? Well, we have a sample of 3,500 participants that broadly resembles the US population, so in gender, age, income, and region, but as prolific apparently as always, overrepresenting the educated people, which probably does not bias things towards procrastination. Now, on average, people have a little bit under 5 contracts. They have 1 internet contract, 1 mobile phone contract. They have a bit more than 2 video streaming contracts, and not everyone has audio streaming, but many do. Now, the planned switching rate over the next 2 months, was much higher for video streaming. Mind you, this includes canceling, and audio streaming then for internet and mobile phone services. And so on average, 9% of the people plan to switch. Okay, so of course, most of people don't plan to switch in the next 2 months. Indeed, they might not even be able to switch because they might be locked into a contract right now, but a little bit under 10% plan to switch. Now, you can look at the actual switching rate conditional on having planned to switch, and it's just 40% on average. Okay, so many, many people who plan to switch in the next 2 months don't switch. Indeed, the majority. Okay, and so we take this as evidence of naive switching plans in line with what other people have found, like Ravert for electricity in Denmark, and a very careful study and so on. So we don't think this is very surprising. I think before the data was in, I once in a talk said, well, if this doesn't work out, then we did something wrong in the survey. So people gave me a lot of shade for that. So the data did come out. We didn't do anything wrong in the survey. This is kind of what you would have expected.
Paul?
Yep.
So I wouldn't disagree that this is broadly what we would expect, but these companies, they make retention offers, right? So you could in principle have a consumer who decides they want to switch, they call up the company, and then they're offered a better deal. I guess this would not be captured. Would that be captured in the survey? So it could be that more than 39% actually tried to switch, but then they got offered a better deal, and so decided not to.
I don't know. We would not quite capture that. I don't think. Yeah, we wouldn't have that in there.
Okay, but it's just a
We
thought.
do have, yeah, we do have some explanations and so on. I could think about how that,
You might be able to find some evidence on how those retention offers differ across markets. So that you could see if that correlates with these differences here across markets.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely not saying this is surprising. I'm just saying that the degree, there might be some people who are trying to switch.
Could be. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, in a sense, then they shouldn't plan to switch in the sense of cancel or something. They should be planning to renegotiate. But yeah, your point is well taken. Okay. But this might help getting at this. So now we've had sort of 2 questions in the first wave. And so one was this hypothetical delegation decision. Right? So this is a hypothetical service. So we offered them to imagine that they could delegate the switching process of the contract they plan to switch without any hassle. So you have someone doing it all for you, right? And then we asked for the highest fee they'd be willing to pay for the service if they would switch in exactly 2 months from now. Right? And so what we find is sort of a low median willingness to pay. The highest is for internet contracts, and there it's $20. So this is not in line with the switching cost estimates from the literature, but it's kind of in line with what you would intuit be a reasonable switching cost, given that it's not so hard to do. And it's much lower than 20 for all other contract services. And then we asked them whether they would prefer delegating switching now at an additional cost of 20% of the savings that switching generates over the next 2 months. Okay? So, you give it to some other service, and in addition, you pay 20% of these savings that the service generates for you. And you should reject this offer only if you expect to switch with a high probability. And so we do this formally in the appendix, but I think it's easy to see. If you don't switch with at least 80% probability, you got to be saving more money if you take the service, right? And you better be also switching quickly within the next 2 months, not just at the end of the period, right? And so consumers delegate for only 23% of the contracts that they plan to switch. So only very few want to delegate. And so the other 77% would have to switch with at least 80% probability, right? So everyone who doesn't delegate should switch with at least 80% probability, implying that you should get a switching rate of 62% and not, 39%. Yeah. Alternatively, we can actually look at the actual switching, and this, this assumes that then the others really switch with 0% probability and so on. So this is very conservative way of looking at the data, right? But the alternative, we can actually just look at the actual switching rate conditional on not delegating. So we can look at those people who didn't delegate, and sort of as a proxy for their naivety or propensity not to switch, we can look at their actual switching behavior. And if you do this, then the switching rate of these non-delegators is about 44% on average across all of these contracts, again, with internet being the lowest. And then, in addition, we have people, you ask people, please explain your reasoning. And then you can sort of group this with ChatGPT and look at it. And the open text explanation are something like, there's no way I'm going to pay. This is easy to do myself for those people who don't take the service. And the service is not worth the costs and things like that. So it's very easy to switch. Mind you, despite the fact that these people don't switch. But they do point out how easy it is to switch. And those that do take the service just say kind of, look, I'm a busy man. It's convenient to take and so on. No one says, I'll do it just to get it done. So I don't forget. So I, self-control, things like that don't show up at all anywhere in these explanations. Okay. Okay, so that was the sort of number one. And so we take this as collaborating evidence that these people really undervalue kind of the value of a commitment to switch and someone else doing it and finding a good deal for you. And then we do a hypothetical contract choice. So we ask respondents to imagine they'll soon move to a new home and have to select a provider. And you can choose between a provider A with a 33% higher regular price, but 3 months for free at the beginning, and a provider B that has a lower regular price but no initially free period, right? So it's 60 and 80 bucks. And then we randomly vary whether you're locked in for 2 years or can switch at any time. Okay. Now, if you can switch at any time, if cancellation is possible, consumers can obviously try and exploit this initial free period of provider A. And so what we observe is, that many of these consumers choose the more expensive contract in anticipation, presumably in anticipation of future switching, right? So if there's a 2-year lock-in period, 90% get it right and take the lower regular price, which is what you pay less. I don't know about the other 10% or 12%. On the other hand, in the full sample, 50% try to exploit the 3 months free period. And now I can sort of look at the same data conditional on these people who planned to switch but failed to do so. And it looks basically the same. And I can even, as a proxy of naivete, look at failure to switch and not willing to delegate. And again, sort of the data looks the same. Okay, so we would argue that this sort of suggests that indeed this future option to switch that they might be unlikely to take motivates them to take the contract that is, more expensive in the long run, but would be cheaper if you were a switching person. Okay, so what did I try to convince you of so far with this? In line with prior evidence, there's failure to switch when having anticipated to do so. And so we argue that suggests consumer naivety. And the future option to switch keeps consumers from selecting options that are better in the long run for consumers who are unlikely to switch. Good. Let me jump to what I should be doing, which is theory. Okay, so now how do we model this? Okay, so we have a simple model where we have a setup. And so consumers need the service, and they get a flow utility. So they need to use a single service from time 0 to infinity. Consumers' tastes are uniformly distributed on the unit interval, so it's a hoteling type model. Services are located at the endpoint of this unit interval. And at any time tau, you get a flow utility that's basically the hoteling utility. So if you subscribe to the service located either at 0 or 1, so that's the location, what do you get? You get a flow utility, which is some gross value of the product, minus the price you're paying for the product, minus, and that's first sort of the 1 here stands for the indicator function. Just ignore the indicator function for a while. Then it's sort of minus the mismatch utility or transportation costs in the hoteling model. Now, the only sort of small difference is we allow the product differentiation to be temporary, so there's a time TD after which the products become homogeneous. Okay, so that's the only non-hoteling or small innovation here. Okay, and so the consumer's problem is initially at period 0 is to select among 2 firms that are located at the endpoint. And then at switching opportunities, and I'll introduce when you have switching opportunities on the next slide, but whenever a switching opportunity comes around, there's some exogenous switching price PS that you can get at either endpoint of the unit interval. Okay, so we're not modeling in the base model the switching opportunities, but just the initial competition. And then you have switching costs, S, and you can switch only once. Of course, with this exogenous switching option, you'll switch to the best one, and then you'll never would want to switch again anyhow. Okay, everyone's with me on this first slide?
So just to clarify, so the TD, that could be infinite, right? So you have product differentiation forever. That's not
exactly. So if it's infinite, we call this permanent product differentiation. I'll get back to that. But with linear pricing, the interesting result is when it's temporary, but then I'll extend and just focus on permanent. But it could definitely be infinity.
And I should think about these switching opportunities as 2 new products, which are perfect substitute for each of the others.
Exact. For each being a substitute for one of the others, yes.
And the initial providers, their prices are fixed forever, or they can also change them at some point?
Well, that wouldn't matter because you could never go to them again. The switching opportunity, you can only go to these exogenous switching opportunities.
Right, but I could drop my price when the switching opportunity arises to deter switching.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have an extension later. I can get to that when you can switch to the switching contracts and they are generated endogenously somehow. But right now, no.
The reason I ask is because, like, if we think about this invest-harvest trade-off,
yep,
usually that's in models where I can price discriminate across time.
Okay, so I can get back to that.
Okay.
Here, my firm can commit to its contract and prices to the future, right? And so then it would just commit to the right price path.
Okay.
At least in the extension with bonus. But now, normally we assume no commitment because otherwise switching cost models have just no bite. Right? So I would argue in reality, firms can commit to much longer. They often commit at least much longer than introductory period pricing. That's something that is sort of a struggle for switching cost models. We can get back to this a little bit more in the end once you understand this logic. We don't need sort of restrictions on how long you can commit. Okay. And so now let me get back to this in particular with bonus periods. I think it becomes interesting.
Okay.
Sorry, could you repeat again? What is D? D.
TD is the time at which the product differentiation ceases to exist. So these products are differentiated temporarily up to TD. That's an exogenous parameter. It could be infinity, then they're permanently, or it could be only a short period of time, as in my sort of motivating stories at the beginning.
So D is, so this D I minus.
There's only TD on the slide, no? TD, that's the time up to which products are differentiated.
So what is D before this I minus?
There, sorry. Okay, sorry. So D, that's the transportation cost in the hoteling model.
Oh, okay.
The
And what is
distance between, that's the cost of the distance between you and the location.
nice?
I see now.
And yeah, what is the difference between this V and the Y? So V is gross value, Y is the taste, but how should we interpret it?
Y is where the consumer is located. So it's as in telling, your
My
your
preference, my
net
taste.
utility is V minus D times L minus Y if products are still differentiated. Does that make
Okay. Yeah.
And
Thank you.
okay, so let me do the timeline of the consumer choice. So at 0, you choose either product 0 or 1 with prices P0 and P1 that will endogenously be determined later on, but from the consumer's problem, he just chooses. Then T is you have a wait time up to T, and then you can switch. Okay, and then you can switch in regular intervals. You have to have wait time W that we use to model procrastination. So then after wait time W, you can switch and so forth until infinity. And at each switching time, there's no commitment. You reconsider as a consumer what you want to do. Okay. And I guess we suppose that you can switch before the product differentiation ceases to exist. That's just a normalization. Okay. Now the consumers discount the long run using a discount rate R. That's the exponential discounting rate that also the firms use. In addition, any payment or future switching costs are discounted at a parameter beta. That's the time inconsistency or present bias parameter by which you downweight, things that happen in the future. Okay. So let me go, this equation is sadly a little long, but let me go through. I only have 2 long equations, so let me go through it. But sort of I'll say in a second what's important. But these consumers are naive, so they don't realize that this time inconsistency, that their preferences change. If you ask them again tomorrow, they'll replan. They don't realize this, so they think any plan they form now, they will fulfill. So from the consumer's perspective, this is just an optimization problem at any point in time, right? And so the consumer, at any switching opportunity, any T here, is going to form a plan on whether to switch and if so, when to switch. Okay. Now, first, suppose you switch right now, then you don't discount. So then beta to this indicator function, that's just 0. So that becomes 1. Epsilon T minus T then becomes 0. So, this drops, and then you just have to pay the switching costs now. And then you get utility from this contract that you switch to from, today until infinity, and you just discount this exponentially. That's this E minus R. And you downweight anything in the future with beta, and this U tau notation is just the flow utility you get from the contract you're holding. So if you're switching now, that would be the best outside option from now on. Okay. If you switch in the future, then you exponentially discount the switching cost, but in addition, you downweight it by beta because it's in the future. That's going to be sort of what makes you procrastinate. You like to delay things to the future. And again, sort of all of this utility you get then in the future, you discount exponentially and then with an extra beta. And
May I
here,
ask a clarifying question?
just a second, the U tau here is the flow utility at period tau, which is written, you can rewrite this, and I didn't show exactly how, but you can rewrite this as your initial choice and the time at which you choose the outside option, because you'll always choose the best outside option. It's kind of clear what this is. Yeah.
So essentially within a period, so I get my flow utility and then I make a decision whether to switch or not. So essentially, I'm not going to discount. So
you pay the switching cost immediately, right?
okay.
So T comes across. You now have to pay this. You now have to sit down and do it. So if you want to switch today, you pay them right now, and you apply no beta to it.
So if I'm paying the switching cost today, I'm not getting the other product today, only from tomorrow. That's what I wanted to
It's
ask.
continuous time, so you get it from almost today.
Right, but I mean,
It
I'm
doesn't
thinking
matter.
about the switching opportunities that come at discrete times. So
Yeah.
okay.
So if you don't switch today, then you're going to hold the wrong product until the next switching opportunity.
Okay, and I can
And
discount
then
it. Oh,
you
okay.
switch then, but then of course you have the futures. Yeah.
Okay, now I understand. Okay, thanks.
And now the initial choice is roughly the same, except initially you choose two things. You choose which firm to buy from initially, that's the L, and then you choose a switching time somewhere in the future. And now the switching time must be in the future, so you always downweight switching costs with beta.
I have a related quick question. So could I just do it? I guess this would work in discrete time. It's just maybe that you would have less flexibility over when the TD is compared to the T, perhaps.
The last model was in continuous time. We let people choose a bonus period, and so later on an extension, and so their continuous time is convenient.
Okay.
There's nothing mystical that exploits continuous time here.
Okay.
It's just convenient for when you choose the length of your bonus period, because then you can adjust it continuously.
Okay.
Okay, and so this sort of describes the consumer behavior, and how it plays out is very simple, and you'll see in 2 slides. And so now we look for a symmetric pure strategy Nash equilibrium in the game between these 2 firms, the initial firms, 0 and 1. So supposing that the firms correctly predict the consumer's behavior, and for simplicity have 0 cost of producing. Okay, and in the basic model, firm 0 and 1 commit to linear prices, P0 and P1. That makes it also very comparable to sort of switching cost models and so on. And then I'm hopefully going to get to the introductory offer model. And there firm 0 and 1 commit to a length of an introductory period, an introductory price, and a post-introductory price. Okay, and there we will allow the consumer to switch whenever the introductory period ends, and then at wait times W thereafter. And if you choose the bonus period far too long, then they can also switch at T, and then always at regular intervals thereafter. Okay, so there's a small technicality here, don't worry about it. You can switch at the end of the bonus period. It seems also very realistic. Okay, now let me start with sort of the benchmark result, and sort of just argue the setup captures this idea that you want to procrastinate and you're willing to pay high prices at the switching opportunities. So in that sense, switching competition is weak. So suppose a consumer bought her favorite product, as they will do in a symmetric equilibrium. Then she prefers to switch next time instead of now if the cost of switching today S are greater than the higher payment you'll have to make until the next switching opportunity, downweighted by beta and sort of exponentially discounted, right? The extra payment, that's the first term, downweighted by beta. And of course, switching tomorrow, you still pay the switching cost, but at a delay. So you downweight this by, E minus RW, that's sort of discounting, the exponential discount to the next period, and then by beta because it's the future. Okay, and so you can rewrite this, and if you believe I can solve an integral, then you can rewrite this, and you get sort of the highest price at which the consumer refrains from switching. And that's this PS plus some markup over RS. Okay? And so observe this can be an arbitrary multiple of PS plus RS. Right? So PS plus RS, sort of that's what a time-consistent consumer would have as a switching price. And this can now be far higher, arbitrarily much higher, right? So even for plausible estimates of beta, people sort of say 0.6 or 0.7, I don't really care. If the wait time is not too high, this can be like a very large number, an arbitrary multiple of the rational switching costs. So this is sort of consistent with the very high switching estimates in the literature that assumes people are time consistent. If you assume people are time consistent, then they'll switch whenever, then the only way to rationalize non-switching is if the savings, which is the right-hand side of this inequality here, P minus PS over R, the discounted savings are less than the switching costs, right? And so, we can get much higher things. And so we interpret this evidence of people having these very high switching cost estimates as implying that P stay is much greater than this PS plus RS, the planned or rational switching point. Okay, so this kind of, this is just capturing the well understood notion that, procrastination can lead to as if high switching costs. Yeah, but they can be really high even for plausible numbers here. And so now we have two benchmarks, and then I get to the result. So suppose first that there wasn't an initial competition. So now suppose that initially both products are owned by monopolists and consumers have some value greater than the switching price for simplicity. And if you don't buy, you get an outside option of 0 at either endpoint. Then if the consumers don't switch, the monopolist must be charging P stay, the highest price, which is determined through the switching competition. That is still feasible with it, exploiting the consumer procrastination. And the equilibrium really depends, you could alternatively you could try and charge V and then you lose the consumer at the first switching opportunity. That's fine. That'll depend a bit on how the firm discounts, how quick the switching opportunity comes, and it depends on P stay. So here P stay fully captures all you want to know about the consumer. This is in line with sort of this explicit argument in the empirical I/O literature that it's as if switching costs is all that matters. This would be right if we'd have a monopoly cell. Now, the other benchmark I want to say is kind of suppose there wouldn't be any switching opportunity. So you choose a provider once and for all. Then, I call D bar the average, sort of the time average product differentiation. Well, if, product differentiation is permanent, then D bar is equal to D. But if it's temporary, then it depends on how long products are differentiated, right? And now if consumers have no opportunity to switch, then the markup would simply be D bar, right? This is the average hoteling parameter. We know in hoteling models, the markup, the price is equal to the product differentiation parameter, and that's exactly the same that goes on here. Since you choose a service that you pay for and consume in the future, time inconsistency wouldn't matter. It's irrelevant. So you compare apples with apples. And so if products are only differentiated for a short period of time, then D bar is low, then you must have very low markups with permanent competition. Okay. Now I'm gonna sort of give you a result on two results on the failure of initial competition. So let me focus on equilibria where consumers do not switch. Of course, in the paper we do everything, but these are kind of the empirically relevant equilibria if you want. And so if consumers were time inconsistent, then there's a switching option that no one takes that does not change anything in this model, right? That cannot hurt anyone, and it wouldn't change how firms would price. Now, in contrast, sort of suppose we have naive present bias consumers, and let me focus on the situation where this minimum of D P stay is greater than D bar. So what does this mean? P stay being greater than D bar means that the switching competition, the price of the switching competition is higher than the average time average product differentiation. So switching competition due to procrastination isn't very severe. And D greater than D bar just says that product differentiation is temporary. It's not permanent. So suppose that's the case. Then there exists a non-switching equilibrium in which present bias consumers pay, whatever is lower D or P stay, if two conditions hold. So condition A kind of, I've already argued that P stay is often much greater than the rational switching price, this PS plus RS. So I think of that even twice, which is a sufficient condition here, but a convenient one. I think of that as a very weak condition. And what it says is the temporary product differentiation sort of has to be big enough. That's condition A. And condition B says, procrastination is either severe enough so that the competition at the switching stage is weak, or you can switch quickly enough. Okay, and then there's some additional condition for the equilibrium being unique. Yeah, and so what's the logic of how can the switching opportunity harm the consumer? Well, due to procrastination, the switching opportunity does not provide real competition. Right? The consumer just doesn't switch unless, the current price is very high, so much higher than sort of the price level in the market, if you want. So the firms initially just realized this, so they are just competing with each other. They realized, there is no effective switching competition that constrains us. But the consumer expect to switch at T. So they evaluate the initial choice from a short-run perspective. They only think about this as a choice up until T, then they will switch. But in the short run, products are more differentiated than in the long run, and so competition is lower. You get sort of the short run, product differentiation determining the price level. And so here's my Bertrand limit. I promised I can generate positive profits in the Bertrand limit. Suppose that products are differentiated up until the first switching opportunity, and now let that go to 0. Then you can switch basically immediately, and you have almost homogeneous goods. But the conditions I had on the last slide, didn't depend on these parameters, or indeed, actually, they got looser. So it was more likely for the positive profit equilibrium to exist. So this says there at least is an equilibrium in which firms earn significant profits, since this naive switching beliefs undermines the initial competition. Okay, and so I think this is sort of theoretically neat. It can happen actually. You often, not always, but often you can have multiple equilibria. That's why we had the uniqueness, where there's a high and a low price equilibrium. If prices are low, consumers don't want to switch. They realize they don't want to switch. So firms are effectively competing for this consumer not expecting to switch, giving you D bar and a very low price. If prices are high, consumers think that you'll switch. Now, if you lower the price a little bit, they think, oh, I was going to switch soon. And in the intermediate, the product differentiation is very high, so they won't respond unless you lower the price a lot. But that's too expensive in terms of profits. So, you get very different type of logic in this model. Okay, so what did I do? I showed you that by inducing incorrect switching beliefs, which makes it seem less relevant to find a good offer today, we can get higher prices if product differentiation is only temporary. Now, what I didn't show you, but it's obvious, if you reduce the wait time in these models, consumers have a greater propensity to procrastinate. If I can switch even quicker in the future, I'm even more prone to procrastination. So that will then generally increase P stay and thereby also hurt consumers. Okay, so it can be hard here to fix competition at the switching stage. So now in general, if you look at the entire parameter space, switching competition can be helpful. Basically, if P stay is low enough, it can be helpful. But then it might not help as much as you expect, because P stay is still not, depending on the amount of procrastination, that sort of determines P stay. So it might help only little, but there are sort of plausible cases where it hurts. Okay, so now I have, 5 minutes left, 6 minutes left. Let me get to one more result that I definitely want to get through. And now let me assume product differentiation is permanent. Okay, so now with linear prices, I would not get harmful competition. But now I allow firms to offer bonus contracts. And so you're going to have an introductory period. In the introductory period, you can choose whatever price you want that is not loss-making. and then you choose a post-introductory price, okay? But the length of your bonus period is as long as you want. There is no constraint on the length of the bonus period. Now, first we sort of observe if you have time-consistent consumers, then in any equilibrium, consumers won't switch. In this model, switching is inefficient, right? So you're just not going to offer an inefficient contract in equilibrium. And you could always make money off offering an efficient contract. And if you want to take money away from the consumer, you can always do this with the initial price before they get an opportunity to switch. So you cannot have switching in equilibrium. So P2 must be less than P stay. And the average price is as most amount of product differentiation D. Remember now it's permanent. So it's just product differentiation D. Any equilibrium with an average price of D exists, and in equilibrium, a firm is indifferent between its equilibrium offer and offering a constant price. So you would never have an incentive to have a cheap introductory period. So there's no benefit from committing to increasing prices here in this basic model. And with an arbitrarily small share of consumers with zero switching costs or low switching costs, you indeed would want to, you'd prefer a price path in which the price is then lower than the outside option, and so that will often give you a decreasing profile. Okay, now that's of course counterfactual. I do realize this. And average prices equal at most the degree of differentiation. So if products are only a little bit differentiated, then we should have very low price equilibrium. Okay. Now I'm going to introduce my naive present bias consumers. And so if consumers are present biased, then the price path is always that the initial period is free, and then the price jumps to P stay. Okay, and then you have some bonus period that is implicitly defined by this equation, right? And you can have multiple equilibria, but in the best equilibrium for the consumer, they are strictly worse off with than without introductory periods, if and only if this condition here holds. Oh, P plan is just PS plus RS, sorry. Okay, if some condition holds. Okay, so let me first give you the intuition and then argue this is a weak condition. So since consumers think they'll switch after the bonus period, they don't think they'll pay P2. So firms are going to charge the highest P2 at which consumers don't switch, which is P stay. That means after the bonus period ended, I will make a lot of profits. But now I could return these profits to the consumer by having a long introductory period, a long bonus period, right? So why don't they do this? Well, if you extend the bonus period by some delta B, right, by an extra month or whatever, then that costs you the revenue that you would make in that extra month. But the consumers thinks they will have switched and pay this low price PS. So the consumer thinks they're not getting much from you because they're not calculating the actual price they're paying, they're calculating the price they think they would be paying, which is much lower. And in addition, they can delay switching by a little bit, but typically that will not be much savings, right? So that makes it hard to attract consumers because for a firm, it's very costly to give the consumer some extra utility. And if it's hard to attract consumers, well, then competition is low. And so introductory periods here often undermine initial competition. Okay. So if consumers are only slightly present biased, so P stay is close to the rational switching price, then theoretically it can go to the other direction. So the rough intuition is they don't misevaluate the bonus periods that much, but they can still, the expectation to switch might mean that if I offer lower price, I get consumers for whom my product is not so good a match. They don't realize that they're going to be sitting on this mismatch for a long time. So you could get sort of the opposite result theoretically, but only if P stay is close to the rational switching price, and that is not consistent with the benefit of switching and estimates of beta around in the literature. And so we have a vague calibration if these products are almost, not differentiated at all. So we do Taylor series expansion about zero differentiation. And, the switching opportunities are really good. So you get zero price. Then we can calculate sort of these savings, and we get to something like 90 times the markup that you would get in the model with time consistent consumers or with no switching opportunities. So we can get dramatic effects. Now, this is when you have a 1-year wait period. If the wait period is smaller, you can multiply this effect. It gets much, much bigger, but it's also very, sensitive to R. So you can also make, this is not, you don't take the 90 serious. What we're trying to indicate is this can be a dramatic effect for plausible parameters. How high, the model can't really say. Okay, so then let me finish by saying, move over to the questions by saying, okay, of course, we do a bunch of extensions and robustness checks. So I've mentioned at the beginning sort of the ability to cancel can make contracts non-exclusive and the consumers hold multiple contracts, reducing competition. We've taken one model to model consumer procrastination, which is the old beta delta model with complete naivety. You can use models of partial naivety, or don't know who Raymond partial naivety, that doesn't change anything. It makes it a little harder, but this is sort of typical in market models. In our model, the consumer overestimates how much in the future they will, how much weight they will put on the benefit from switching. You can symmetrically think of them as underestimating future switching costs. That'll lead to the same sort of logic. Overconfidence about future memory or attention, which are other models of procrastination. We say about how we can reinterpret our parameters in a specific way, but to capture this or the overestimation of the benefit from switching. So it's, we don't think it hinges on the particular procrastination model we have chosen. In our model, you had the bonus period length, because we said, we have these models around with a few arbitrageurs and money-making offers in the marketplace. We kind of know this is hard. So we just imposed you can't make it. We have an alternative where you can make monetary bonus offers. So you can just give the consumer money. Probably not very realistically, but you could do it. Now, in our exact setup, where the firms do one contract offer, this will lead to this is the one result that turns this around. It leads to cutthroat competition because you think you'll switch immediately, so you'll take the larger bonus and firms will compete to get you and you get all the money back. But we then show that really relies on you not being able to take both firms' contract. Suppose you can take both initial firms' contract, you can switch from over the 2 bonus contracts. Then the consumer will plan to do so. So the size of the bonus doesn't really matter because he thinks he's going to select both. And he'll want to end up with, the right contract second, typically the cheaper price if products aren't too differentiated. And that can lead to really perverse effects where the consumer takes the worst contract first, thinking they'll switch, and then they don't switch. So we have some robustness discussion and argue that it also works with monetary bonuses, but this is just a teaser. So you're not meant to have fully understood this. But we claim this also works, but we kind of know, that involves very money-losing offers. We kind of know that that could be problematic. While, I think there's no paper around that says bonus periods couldn't be longer. And indeed, I should emphasize in our model, the only commitment you need is the commitment on prices for the length of the bonus period. Afterwards in the model, you would want to charge P-stay anyhow. So as long as you can commit for the length of the bonus periods, our result on the bonus models go through. Okay, and then let me finish I think people have asked about this. In the model, the switching opportunity is exogenous. We then have an extension where in continuous time, new consumers show up. And then there's always 2 firms that make offers to these new consumers at any given point in time. You can't observe past offers. You could at a cost. But since we have a pure strategy equilibrium, no one would ever want to do so. And at any point in time, for technical reasons, it's new firms that make these offers. And then everything goes through. But now these bonus offer, the outside options is endogenized. And so then consumers will think they'll jump from bonus to bonus up to infinity, never pay a positive price, just not to do so. Okay, and I think I should really leave time for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, as usual, I'm going to ask our panelists to perhaps take the lead with the questions. Yair, Andrew, whichever one wants to go first.
I can start. I have two thoughts or comments. One is about the basic model. I mean, the switching opportunities are exogenous and firms commit at time zero. But if I'm not mistaken, the result will, I mean, this specific non-switching equilibrium would hold even if firms didn't have the ability to commit, right? Because essentially you look at the expectations in the future, and so
I think it depends a little bit how you think of it. So, if firms can't commit to their prices at all, then the prices have no meaning. If in continuous time I can change my price at any point in time, then kind of the initial prices have no meaning.
yeah, but what if I could change my prices only at switching opportunities? Then I
Yeah.
think,
Well, then you would want to, so without commitment, then you would want to raise it to P stay. So in the bonus model, you're right, it doesn't matter at all. In the linear price model, it would matter. You would want to change the price.
I
Now,
always charge
the
fees.
linear price model for us was a way to compare it to the literature. And we kind of said, look, we do all of this with commitment. So really, it's not the usual switching cost story of firms not being able to credibly promise the consumer not to rip them off in the future, where we think this is often a much smaller problem, right? Like you can have credit contracts that are maybe indexed, but according to clear rule, and that have 30-year commitment or something like that. So we often don't think this commitment problem is as big as we might sort of think in IO because we tend to write these models without commitment. So that's kind of why we have it. And then sort of there's this, we can quote Paul Klemperer as sort of the ultimate authority on switching cost models is saying, look, if you got commitment, we know it doesn't matter. So and that's it. But yeah, you're completely right. It's really easy to think in the bonus period model. All you need to do is commit for the length of the bonus period. And then you will charge P stay, and then you're spot on, and you get exactly the same result. And so often these bonus periods in practice are 3 to 6 months, and firms commit to prices for up to 2 years. So we really think the commitment is not a problem. And in our model, it's enough if they can commit initially for the introductory period. So that's spot on correct.
I see. I had two other thoughts. One is about a classic question in the behavioral IO literature is about the incentive to educate consumers, to make them aware of their bias. And it seems that here challenges, and I know that they are exogenous in the model, but if they weren't, they would have an incentive to educate consumers, to explain them that they tend to procrastinate or underestimate the probability that, overestimate the probability that they will switch in the future, right? Or am I missing something here?
So I think that's right. Of course, I sort of think you can easily, or easily. So I don't think you can easily, but in our models typically easily. But I think it's easier to educate consumers about facts of the environment than about their own personal tendency to procrastinate. Okay, so I think that's a hard one to do. Governments try to do this all the time. In the UK, they send letters where they find the alternative switching deal, and they do everything for you. You just da da da, and it's very hard. Firms try and do stuff like it's a one-off opportunity. You're never going to get it again. Right? That would work, if it's only now, then you can't be procrastinating. So it sort of has the right psychology, but of course, consumers know that this only now offers, or maybe not, of course, but I think consumers know these only now offers from experience, they come every month. So there's a lack of, if you don't give this offer next once, then your competitor will. So I think, it's right. Now, in the extension, these firms live by selling to other consumers, and they similarly want to exploit this tendency to procrastinate, right? So it's not, you know.
I see. I see. Finally, it's kind of a cheap shot in these kind of models. But I mean, it's essentially it's a dynamic model, and consumers do not learn from their mistakes. And one thing that I had in mind is essentially your previous paper on kind of foundations to naive present bias that I mean you didn't mention now, but actually I think that you should mention.
I think you should. So there we would say that learning is environment specific. Okay, so in our model, right, they rationalize things to marginal utility just to, you know, this is going to be hard for others to follow. So let me try and give a broad sketch. So, you know, consumers fail. So like here, consumers fail to switch. In the beta delta model, nevertheless, every point in time, they think they're going to switch tomorrow. At some stage, they should get a clue. This is just, okay. And now often sort of seminar audiences and so on then say, oh, they must learn the right thing, i.e. better in the sort of that, which, and in that paper, we say, no, they must learn, but they might learn about something else. So what they would do in this type of environment is they would rationalize. They're not switching. With switching is just a real hassle for me. So they would indulge the belief that they have very high switching costs. That could rationalize their non-switching behavior. Of course, once they're chosen the initial contract, they're locked in. Of course, in reality, sometimes the switching costs are zero. You know, sometimes people get their life in order and do switch. So that would take it a little further. I don't know. I'd have to think this through carefully, but you know, the way I would think of it is them learning over time that they have higher switching costs, but environment specific. And kind of here, you know, they don't make, because it's a permanent contract, they don't make choices again and again and again. So I think sort of the learning might be too late.
Because essentially you make only one choice and then you learn that I'm not switching, but okay. I see.
All right.
Right. Thank you.
Andrew.
Yeah, so one of my comments was, I think, basically the same. I was sort of thinking initially I might procrastinate, but over time you would think I would realize that. I guess that's not going to change the fundamental logic behind the model, though.
Yeah. So then sort of what you realize might be important, right? So in my story, I made it simple. And so you realize you don't switch. So you think you have high switching costs. So and we allow in that other model, we allow uncertainty about some marginal utility that you could translate this into a high switching cost in these settings. Then you can rationalize what you observe and still believe that you're time consistent.
Right. I have in mind
That
something
wouldn't
slightly
work.
different.
You had in mind, I learn now. Once I learn that I don't do it, I must be doing it now.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
so I'm not too worried as long, you know, consumers can't learn too quick. So firms do earn some profits. That's fine. You know, and then at some stage they switch with some, you could put some process on consumers waking up or something like that. I wouldn't worry too much. I mean, the fact that no one ever switches and so on is just to keep the model simple. Like you could also have periods where they have zero switching costs or something. We had that in an old version with a Bertrand model that, you know, that didn't really change things.
Yeah, so that was something else I was wondering. What if you have heterogeneous switching costs, which don't change over time? Then again, I guess it's not going to change the logic, but it would give you something a little bit richer because then you would have some people switching.
Yeah. So, you know, you could, you know, one thing I could do that's easier is I'll just give me, you know, a small fraction of time consistent consumers, and then they'll switch. But nothing would change on the prices I want to set if this is small enough, because my profits would be dominated by the other consumers. And you can't continuously, you wouldn't want to continuously adjust. You would actually give the exact same contract. With heterogeneous switching costs, it becomes a bit more, you know, now I have heterogeneous switching costs and heterogeneous taste. So off path, I think the appendix would become unreadably long. From the logic, I don't see how anything would change. You would do the monopoly price. So I don't think anything fundamentally changes, and some consumers would switch. But
But
you
you
know, I
basically have
have
a
to
downward.
focus also for all out of equilibrium offers.
Hmm.
For these out of equilibrium offers, I have to specify demand, which is derived from these consumers who misunderstand things. It sort of gets a little
Okay.
unnice there. So I would hope the referees will not force us to do this, but I'm
Okay.
pretty sure that it would work.
And then finally, one other cheap question, which is this PS is just taken as exogenous.
Yep.
But is there a way to endogenize it or to sort of explain where these alternatives come from and why they're, in some sense, should I think of them as non-strategic or?
So the way we do it is this endogenous switching options where we just have in continuous time, at any point in time, there's some new consumer showing up in the market. The new consumers are distributed on the hoteling line.
Mm-hmm.
There's always two firms that show up at any instant in time, and they make offer to these new consumers. Any old consumer could switch to the contract for new consumers. That's the contracts that are around in the marketplace at that point in time. And so what
Okay.
happens then is, you have these bonus period contracts, and this PS is close to zero because consumers think they'll jump from bonus period to bonus period, never paying the post-introductory price. But that was sort of the endogenous PS that we have in the model.
Okay.
Now, in all fairness, I should admit that at any instant in time, we have two new firms entering, because if I deviate with two firms, you must know that I deviated. And then I can just generate all kinds of continuation games, that are a mess. And the firms will know, and it just gets very, very long. So again, I don't think it matters, but to keep things tractable, it's the easiest way to keep things tractable. But basically the story is the consumers correctly expect that the current offers are available today and at any point in the future.